All right, next question. Someone asked me about Jonestown. Well, I mean, what do you want to know about it? There was a pastor. He was from Indiana. He was the first person in the state of Indiana to have any interracial adoptions. Um, he was a pastor. I believe he had been kind of a Pentecostal, like a charismatic Christian, but he was a white man, but his congregation was mainly people of color, and he believed in kind of Christian socialism. And he claimed that he could perform miracles, and he couldn't. He was lying. He was one of these phony faith healers, right? And he was in Indiana for a while, and he had a church, mainly black congregants, and this was like in the early 60s. And then he moved his congregation. He was very afraid of nuclear war. So he moved his congregation to Northern California to a place called Ukiah, California. And Ukiah, California was believed to be one of the safest places in the United States if there was a nuclear war. And he was very afraid there was going to be a nuclear war. So he lived in Ukiah, California. And it was a cult, and it was a cult, all along, right? He was claiming he could perform miracles. He could not perform miracles. It was phony. He would do staged, like, faith healing kind of stuff. But he called himself a socialist, too. He claimed he was a socialist. He claimed to be Native American because he had dark black hair and he was not Native American. And he was a low-income white person from Indiana who, had a single mother and grew up believing in Christianity, and decided that, he was going to become a Christian pastor, started staging faith healing, which, unfortunately, there's a long tradition of that. There's actually a movie about fake faith healers. Steve Martin made a movie called The Leap of Faith, and there's a whole, faith healers, that's a big thing in the United States, unfortunately. Not nowadays, not so much, because of, like, technology. You can, like, catch people doing this. But unfortunately, throughout U.S. history, there's a lot of, fake faith healers. There's a guy who had a TV show called Crossing Over. He claimed he could talk to the dead. And there's a lot of people who I do not understand it. I really, really do not understand why people lie like that, right? I was actually talking to somebody who'd done some research into it. And they said that actually the way a lot of this is kind of a divergent tangent, but that's okay. A lot of the way that these faith healers will justify what they're doing is that in their mind, they're so crazy and narcissistic. They actually believe that they do have magical powers, but they're convinced they have to lie so that the other people will see that they really do have the powers. I kid you not. Like in their mind, that somehow makes sense, right? Well, I have to lie because I have magical powers, but other people can't really see it. So I have to lie so people understand that I have powers. I mean, it's like unbelievable. Unbelievable. But anyhow, this guy, he moves from Indiana to Ukiah. He's got his little cult that he has in Ukiah. And they're in California. It's the 1960s. They're kind of a hippie group. And again, he kind of believes in socialism, kind of. He's a very charismatic speaker, fake faith healing. And that the church in Ukiah, in Ukiah, people notice that something's a little bit off. Like one thing that Jim Jones Church does is that they have corporal punishment, right? If you break the rules of the church, they spank you with a paddle. I mean, that's sick. These are adults, and this is, like, what, right? And there's a woman in Ukiah, and she's in the group, and she goes to work, and people notice that, that she's been, like, beaten, and she's quitting the group, and that the group is, like, a little bit off, right? And that stuff is going on in the group that's a little unhealthy. Like, for example, in Jim Jones' church, I believe, when you got higher up in the church, in order to prove your loyalty to Reverend Jim Jones, you had to write in your own hand a letter confessing to molesting your own children that he would keep on file in case you betrayed him. And then if you betrayed him, he would give it to Children's Services and you would lose custody of your children. Sick group, right? The leader of the group is this megalomaniac guy who's very paranoid and very, and is fake faith healing there in Ukiah. 60s goes on. I think he spends some time in Argentina, or Chile. He goes to South America for like 2 years. Who the hell knows why? And then finally, in like the early 70s, he moves to San Francisco. Now, San Francisco in the 1970s. Now, this is where things get interesting because there's a lot of like confused history about all of this, right? People will tell you Jim Jones claimed he was a communist all along. That's not true. He was always kind of a weird quasi-Christian socialist or whatever. But in San Francisco in the 1970, San Francisco was just a hotbed of political activism. Just, I mean, it was a political center, right? I mean, you had Berkeley and what was going on at Berkeley, and the free speech movement and all of that. You had the Black Panthers, and that the Bay Area at that point in like 1970 was a hotbed of left wing activism. So he moves to San Francisco and he changes his church a whole lot because, I mean, it's a totally new atmosphere. The Black Panthers are out there and stuff. So suddenly he's not just preaching this vague kind of Christian socialism. He's claiming that he's a communist. And best he's claiming he's a communist, but he claims to be the unified reincarnation of both Jesus Christ and Lenin. And he kind of recruits in two different ways. To a lot of people, he's recruiting on the basis of, hey, we're a church and we do faith healing. But to like young communist radicals, he's recruiting as, hey, the way to really build communism in the United States is to infiltrate the church. So a lot of like young communist white people join his church thinking, okay, this is the way to like recruit people to communism. And a lot of people of color join on the basis of this is just a church that does faith healing and has a really nice energy and stuff like that. And it becomes really a big deal in San Francisco politics. And now in San Francisco, there was a very liberal mayor, George Moscone. And Moscone was not a socialist, but he was like a Bernie Sanders. It was a progressive. He was probably one of the most liberal mayors that we've seen around the country. I mean, he was a really left-wing mayor, George Moscone. And George Moscone, he gets the support of Jim Jones. Jim Jones gets all his people to go out and campaign for him for office, right? First of all, San Francisco, you have to remember, is also the gay center. It's the center of the gay rights movement. Harvey Milk he's the first openly gay elected official, and he makes an alliance with Reverend Jim Jones. Now, what's interesting is that Reverend Jim Jones is very homophobic, right? Now George Moscone and Harvey Milk are pro-LGBT rights. Reverend Jim Jones is wildly homophobic, and in fact, one of the beliefs of the People's Temple is that everyone is secretly a homosexual. Right? And that only through Jim Jones's church can you cure yourself of your homosexuality deep down. That's one of their beliefs. Just a wild group. They have the corporal punishment. They have the weird like confessions that you sign all over your property to them. It's a cult. It's a classic cult, right? I mean, you're not allowed to have any of your own property. It's a dangerous authoritarian cult, right? We also know that Jim Jones was sleeping around in the group and he was having sex with women to help cure them of their homosexuality. He was having sex with men to help them realize they had this problem with homosexuality. It's a demented group, right? I mean, and they're, Jim Jones is the absolute leader, and it's a pretty wild group. So that happens, but, this is San Francisco in the 1970s. The Black Panthers are there, right? And so Jim Jones starts presenting himself more and more as a communist, right? He starts quoting Marx in his sermons, and Angela Davis becomes a member of the People's Temple. Huey Newton becomes a member of the People's Temple, right? They join in because it's this really important church, and they do really big fundraisers for liberal politicians in San Francisco, right? This guy's really important. When George Moscone gets elected as mayor of San Francisco, he appoints Reverend Jim Jones to be the head of the Housing Commission, right? So he's actually the head of the Housing Commission, right? And instead of the housing, public meetings just being these dull meetings, he turns them into like crazy political rallies. He's just this wild figure, wild figure, in San Francisco politics. So, George Moscone is very liberal, very left-wing. Harvey Milk is very, very liberal and left-wing. They're both associated with radical politics and protest groups, and Jim Jones is their ally. So, it comes out that Jim Jones, they start exposing some of Jim Jones's malfeasance, right? Magazines start running reports about the beatings in the group and about the sex stuff in the group. and about all the bad things that Reverend Jim Jones is doing. People are talking about how when they quit the group, they like feared for their lives, and all this negative stuff is coming out about the group, right? Jim Jones is kind of being exposed as, you know, what he is. So he takes all of his followers and they buy land in Guyana. Now, Guyana at that point is a kind of a pro Soviet military junta, right? It's a pro Soviet government in Guyana in South America. So Jim Jones, in the middle of the jungle, in the middle of nowhere in Guyana, they set up Jonestown and they start saying, you know what? In San Francisco, all these bad things are being said about us in the media. We're going to get out of the country. We're going to move to Guyana. And so thousands of his followers move to Guyana, right? He's been exposed in San Francisco politics, so they all moved to Guyana. And so they have this little like commune in the middle of the woods. And of course, rumors are starting to circulate about some of the bad things that are going on in Jonestown, which apparently, Jim Jones is, it's already a wacky group. They're spanking people and he's having sex with everybody and they're torturing people and stealing all their property. It's already a wacky, scary cult, okay? But in Guyana, you can't go anywhere. You're in the middle of the jungle. So it starts to get really wild. Like he's got solitary confinement cells where he leaves people in solitary confinement. And they got big speakers set up where you hear Jim Jones talking at you all day while you do agricultural work. And it's pretty wacky. So at that point, members of the U.S. Congress, decide they're going to fly to Jonestown and find out if the rumors are true. So members of Congress come to Jonestown, and the video seems to show the members of Congress. They're there. The people seem nice. Everyone seems happy. A couple people say they want to leave with the members of Congress, but for the most part, most people just want to stay in Jonestown, right? And Reverend Jim Jones, he's a little bit disturbed that these people want to leave, but for the most part, they leave a good impression. The congressmen are kind of happy with what they see. So then, as the congressmen are leaving, people open fire and they kill, the congressman on the airplane. What do you call it? The runway, the air at the airstrip. They, the congressmen are killed. So then after that, and I guess from what everyone understands, it was Jonestown people that killed the congressman. So then after that, Reverend Jim Jones, he gets on his microphone and he says, we're going to commit mass suicide. And apparently they had rehearsed this many, many, many times. They had rehearsed this in Jonestown, that they would practice committing suicide as a group. And in fact, many times Jim Jones would tell them they were drinking cyanide, and they weren't drinking cyanide, right? And it was to test your loyalty to the group. They would all drink their cyanide and then not die, and it was like a test of your loyalty. Well, this time they all line up and they drink their cyanide and they all die. And Reverend Jim Jones is shot in the back of the head, and it's the biggest mass death of American citizens until 9/11, right? Well over 1,000 people, I think, if I'm not mistaken. It's a huge incident, the Jonestown mass suicide in Guyana. And it's a horrible incident, and it's very weird. And it's just very, very weird. The whole thing is really, really strange. It's a strange incident, and it's kind of the tragedy of the 1960s. I think that what had happened was that that as a result of of the defeat of the Black Panther Party, the decline of the Revolutionary Movement, there was widespread demoralization in the Revolutionary Movement, and some of these weird cults started to emerge to kind of take the place of Marxism as Marxism was defeated, and that happened. And it's a really tragic incident. I mean, it's really tragic and horrible. And, Jim Jones was clearly a narcissist, a psychopath, a power-hungry, evil person. Unfortunately, he aligned himself with the Marxist movement for his own strategic ends. There's some people who say he was a CIA agent. There's some some people who say they didn't kill themselves. It was staged. They were mad. I don't go there. I really don't go there. I don't go there. It's a horrible incident. That's that. That's all there is to it. It's deeply tragic. What's interesting is shortly after, like a week afterwards, George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, who, who Jim Jones got elected, and Harvey Milk, the city council, the city alderman, who Jim Jones also got elected, were assassinated by a former police officer. Came and shot George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, and Harvey Milk inside of the city hall, right? And it was a big deal. The mayor of a major city got assassinated. Very big incident. Very, very big incident. But it happened right after Jonestown. And so, in the aftermath of the killing of Harvey Milk, the killing of George Moscone, who becomes mayor of San Francisco? Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein, who had run against George Moscone from the right, had said that George Moscone was too far left, gets to be mayor of San Francisco. So Dianne Feinstein becomes mayor of San Francisco in the aftermath of the assassination of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. And Dan White, the guy who shot George Moscone and Harvey Milk, gets a 2-year prison sentence. Now, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Who in the right mind how in the world does one kill the mayor of San Francisco and a city council member of San Francisco and get 2 years in jail? It's wacky, right? And that's what some people think there's a wider conspiracy there. You know, it's a wacky, wacky story. So Dan White, he gets this 2-year prison sentence. And his defense in court is the infamous Twinkie defense that Dan White killed the mayor of San Francisco and killed Harvey Milk because he ate too much junk food. He argues to the court he ate too much junk food, right? So he's found guilty, but he only gets a 2-year sentence because clearly the Twinkies got into his brain. It's a very, very strange case. Very, very strange case. The whole thing is very, very strange. But that was kind of how the socialist wing of San Francisco politics was exterminated, right? Because San Francisco, Harvey Milk, George Moscone had been friendly with the Communist Party and had been friendly with, the various Trotskyite groups and Maoist groups. And Angela Davis had been a member of the People's Temple and the Black Panther. And there was a whole wing of the Democratic Party in San Francisco that was moving in a kind of socialist, anti-imperialist, and pro-gay rights direction. Jonestown, the assassination, the Dan White assassination, and all of a sudden Dianne Feinstein and the clique that brought us Nancy Pelosi and all of them are in power. And it looks a lot like some kind of coup or something. It was a strange occurrence, but it was kind of, it was about how a very radical San Francisco was kind of put under the control of the establishment. And this was the Carter administration, right? This was the Carter administration was very much like a kind of a truth and reconciliation for the 1960s. They had the Church Committee, which was investigating the FBI and the CIA and going over MKUltra and COINTELPRO. You also had, at that point, Jimmy Carter was doing a lot of things. He pardoned people who had resisted the draft in Canada. And so there was an attempt to kind of end the political crisis of the 1960s, and San Francisco,